Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Sports Experience Podcast with your host, Chris Quinn.
And Dom DiTolla.
And this week, we're going to talk about drugs in baseball. But before we get into that, I want to do a little bit of promoing. For those of you who don't know, me and Dom are both comedians here in Tucson. And Dom is on a CD called Tucson Bullies Volume 1 with some other great Tucson comics, Roy Lee Reynolds, Andrew Scott, Tony Shinfoot Brune, and our very own Dom make up this lineup for the Tucson Bullies. So go check that out. Our very own Ty Podcast was the producer on that. So
shout out to Engle Studio for making it happen. Seriously.
Yeah. Make sure you go and listen to that and check out Dom's comedy. Mm-hmm. And without any further French words, we're going to get right into this podcast.
Yeah.
Part 1 of Drugs in Baseball. This is going to be a multiple parter. This episode is going to be all about Greenies.
Yeah, Greenies. For those of you who aren't familiar with that slang term, it's basically methamphetamine in pill form.
Yeah,
uppers,
the nicknames they had them was Greenies and Beans. I never heard them called Beans.
I never heard it called Beans either. It's like, oh, I'm beaning up here. I'm thinking like, oh, you're going to taco shop at 1:30?
Well, exactly. I wonder if it came from like the 50s and 60s, and then it just kind of went out, like beaning up. The terminology just kind of went out, and just everyone was like, oh, the Greenies, man. Yeah,
just slang, just like, hey, going out there, playing some ball, taking meth. Let's see where this goes.
Exactly. We're going to get jacked up on amphetamines, and we're just going to see where the world, see where the ball takes us. Because that's what I felt like a lot of the guys in this era, which was a huge era. This is probably the drug that is in baseball the most.
It's not only the drug that's in baseball the most, it's like from the time that it was introduced until the time it was kind of like eventually phased out, it was the golden era of baseball, if you think about it.
Definitely.
I mean, from like the late 40s until you start seeing other drugs, which we'll discuss in future episodes, until maybe like the mid to late 80s is like kind of that golden era of baseball.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the introduction of Greenies. Yeah. So World War II happened. A bunch of baseball players went and fought for our country and then came back. And in the military, they were given these pills, these Greenies, to
dexedrine. That's what they were called. Yeah,
to stay awake for 24 hours, to to keep them awake during battle, all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, like pep in their step, basically.
Yeah.
It was either like you're going to stay awake and pull an all-nighter like on watch, or like you've just fought like 3 days in a row and you're mentally and physically fatigued.
Exactly.
But you need to march another like 20 miles.
So
take some.
These ex-militaries coming back to professional baseball, a lot of them, like the Ted Williams era. A lot of people say Ted Williams was a guy, especially in Boston, that kind of introduced everybody like, hey, check this out. This new pill will make you focused.
And to Ted Williams' credit, great fighter pilot in World War II. Not only World War II, but Korea, like former Yankees second baseman and longtime late Padres announcer Jerry Coleman. And you basically needed these pills if you're flying these horrendous, dangerous missions.
Yeah, exactly.
So, necessity is the mother of invention. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're coming back and you're like, what if I incorporated these into playing a game where I don't have to kill people?
Exactly. And it really took MLB by storm at that point, because it really made all the players who were not as focused for 9 innings.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about this particular drug in baseball, where it kind of finds a home, is the fact that with these Greenies, these dexedrine, and they also took benzedrine as well towards like the 60s and 70s, is that baseball has the longest season. We had talked about this. You're basically playing 162 games over like a 6 to 7 month span.
Yeah, it's like 180 days, or
I
forget
180 to 200 days, which is still like a lot.
Yes, it's ridiculous.
And, sometimes you need that little extra pick-me-up, because it's not necessarily a performance enhancer like a steroids, but it will keep you focused, it'll keep you dialed in, and guys would take them either to play or just to get out of a horrible hangover because they played so many day games up until really the 1990s.
And you got to think of double headers too. You're like, after the first game, you take, a little. But that's the thing is, and it's hard to tell how many pills guys were taking in the 50s and 60s, but I feel like in the 70s is when guys started to take like a ton of like 15 to 20 pills, and that's when I feel like it really becomes performance enhancing and performance hampering. It has to have that tipping point.
And Phil Garner, second baseman for the Pirates in the 70s and 80s, manager of the Milwaukee Brewers, talked about how he took them because some guys didn't like him. Some guys would take him and be like, this is way too much for me.
Yeah.
I can't do it. It hampers my performance. And they're just done, like after one thing. And Garner even mentioned how addictive they are.
Mm-hmm.
Like some guys would take them once and then just, go crazy with them.
Not be able to play, or the mindset of not being able to play without them. We just did a podcast on Doc Ellis.
Yeah.
One of the best pitchers out there for many of things outside of pitching. Let me just say that.
Absolutely.
And he said that he never pitched sober. He pretty much had greenies in his system the entire time. And he was taking so much at points in his career that you can just see when you watch old videos of him just literally chewing his gum to dust.
And and you can see those bouts of erratic control on the mound too.
Yes, and erratic behavior.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's the most important thing, is a lot of these guys, would never act that way if they just kind of had their shit together.
Yeah, we were talking about, he plunked a bunch of reds, and he was talking about how it was pretty much all amphetamine driven.
Anger,
that he had so much anger for these guys, he actually wanted to hurt them, not just hit them, and because you're supposed to throw in the lower region of somebody's, and he was like thrown at their heads.
Which is just bad form overall.
And just you could see the mindset of some of these guys who it's just like an incorrect amphetamine driven mindset. It's almost drug psychosis.
It really is drug psychosis. And one of the interesting things I kind of found out about this is the clubhouse managers and the clubhouse attendants and even the people in the front office, they basically turned a blind eye and fed into it.
Oh, not even turned a blind eye. I felt like they were actively giving it out.
Exactly, and which they were. Doc Ellis would talk about his no-hitter, how someone was just waiting there with a bag full of Benzedrine and Dexies, just ready for him to pitch.
Yeah, because they knew that that's what he needed to get on the mound.
And it's almost that culture that promoted it, that if you're a guy, and I mean, I'm sure it permeated into the minor leagues as well, but if you're that guy coming up and you just see bowls of these things, which guys discuss, in the locker room, in the clubhouse, and they're just taking them by the handful, you're like, oh, I guess this is what big leaguers do.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I read was almost all of the clubhouses had two kinds of coffee.
Yeah.
And they called it leaded and unleaded. And it wasn't caffeinated
like
and
Roadhouse.
decaf. Yeah, it wasn't caffeinated and decaf. It was literally a regular pot of coffee and then some with a ton of greenies in it. And there's stories out there of like security guards coming in and just trying to get a cup of coffee and then getting the wrong.
Yeah, I had read about that.
In the Dodgers, and he got the wrong one, and he literally went like red, and they had to call an ambulance to come and pick him up because he was like overdosing on greenies essentially.
And that has to suck. Like unknowingly taking drugs, particularly that drug. Oh my God. Like, ooh.
I bet it would be almost impossible to calm down.
Yeah, and that was the Paul LaDuca story. That had to have happened in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I mean, because Greenies, for those of you who don't know, really weren't banned until 2006.
Yes.
Like, even during the Mitchell report for steroids and performance-enhancing drugs, like, Greenies are as baseball is as American as apple pie and fucking Chevrolet.
Well, that's how I was so surprised that they were essentially not only turned the blind eye, but not made illegal in drug testing until 2006. That like proves that baseball pretty much was promoting like a silent promotion of this drug.
Yeah, I got a great quote here from Chuck Dobson. He was a pitcher for the A's during the early 70s when they were winning all those World Series, because the commissioner at the time, Bowie Kuhn, was very shocked and angered at the pervasive greenie use in baseball.
Yeah.
So Chuck Dobson said, well, when you've got the flu and you got to pitch, what else are you going to do? We play 162 games in 180 days.
Yeah.
Like,
what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah.
You're not going to miss that start.
No.
It's such an interesting, because they play so many games. This makes, throughout this research, it made me appreciate, and I don't think he necessarily was on Greenies, but who knows? But it makes me appreciate Cal Ripken's record so much more.
Oh, right.
Because he just played for like 2 decades constantly.
I know,
without,
every day. Yeah.
And it's one of those things where you're like, well, if he was on Greenies, screw it, man. Good for him. Which I don't think he was.
There have been there haven't been any drug at all allegations towards him.
Not even a little bit.
I think he was just like a freak of nature who just loved baseball.
Yes.
So
that's it, but it just makes me respect that record so much.
Right.
Like, that was something I loved from this. Another Paul LaDuca story, though, is he came out and said that he thought some players would prefer Greenies over roids. And it made me think, like, maybe for certain positions and for certain guys, but I feel like this is like a drug preference where you're like, I like to smoke weed as opposed to do coke, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And some guys would be like, I want the Greenies over the roids. And I don't think it would be, it's so hard to say that it would be a popular opinion throughout MLB, but I think a lot of guys got so reliant on Greenies.
You're addicted, basically,
Yes.
and it's so pervasive. It's like almost chewing tobacco.
Yes.
Like it's everywhere. Sunflower seed. Like they would talk about how Greenies were as available as bubblegum, dip, and sunflower seeds.
Yeah, in the
locker
clubhouse.
rooms.
Yeah.
And in the dugout, like guys would have them on them.
Yeah.
Take that little what was it? Rolling Stones' Mother's Little Helper.
Yeah.
You know.
It's one of those things that.
Well, one of the phrases that I found very interesting, I've heard multiple players use it. I think Darryl Strawberry had used it. When you're not taking Greenies, they would refer to it as playing naked.
Yeah.
During this era, is like this guy is playing naked. And I didn't even realize, because I thought it had been more or less phased out until they had banned it in 2006. But in 2003, there was a New York Times article where Tony Gwynn, Padres Hall of Famer, had said he wasn't a Greenies guy, but they had asked him, like, hey, about now, because he retired, I think, 2001, how many people, like, what's the ratio of guys who use Greenies to not right now? And he said, it's probably about 50-50.
Yeah.
Still.
Well, that's the thing about, and we saw it in the Doc Ellis documentary, one of his teammates was asked, do you think that this report that 90% of baseball players use Greenies? And he said, no, it's more like 95%. And it's one of those things where you're like, oh my God, like it's literally like a couple of maybe like super religious guys are just like, no, I can't do it. You know what I mean? Like literally every ball player in the 70s was on this.
And it was probably, like you said, the religious, like, you know, straight edge people or guys who probably did it once and were like, because Jim Button in his book Ball 4, which is great, had talked about how he took it once and he was just like, I was too damn erratic. I did not perform up to my standards, so I never did it again.
Yeah.
So.
Mike Schmidt, too, said he took it once, but then...
It said he took it more than once.
Yeah, and then stopped talking about it, but it's one of those things where he's like the greatest third baseman ever, and you know what I mean, where these...
And Hank Aaron admitted to using it once.
Yeah.
You know, it seems like one of those things where it'll never get out, because Gwynn took a lot of heat for what he said, just mentioning 50-50.
Yeah.
Because like there's the code in baseball, kind of like in that Phillies book, you'll read about it, where whatever happens in this clubhouse doesn't leave.
Well, look how Canseco was completely vilified. And we'll get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But he, you know, the code in baseball, what's said here, what's done here stays here. But what ends up happening, and you find this with any walk of life, it's not just baseball. It could be another sport. It could just be, you know, a company. If you let stuff get out of control and fester and try and keep a lid on it, it's almost like the Black Sox with the betting.
Yes.
Something's going to come out and it's going to be really dangerous.
Well, I feel like the Major League Baseball flat out has never learned its lesson, and you keep seeing them do the exact same thing, which is sweep it under the rug, and it really creates these gigantic problems where you see almost the entire roster on a ball team is addicted to this, you know, these Greenies.
Particular drug.
Yeah.
And they were dependent on it to play. I mean, and baseball players, by and large, this isn't a knock, but they're generally heavy drinkers. They're generally heavy partiers. They're generally dicks.
Yeah. Well,
and like most professional athletes. But when you have that lifestyle and you're playing that schedule to get you all the way through, you're playing a lot of day games.
Hey, everybody. Just want to take a quick break to let you know that our Sports Experience podcast is brought to you by Engle Studio here, and they're here in Tucson for all your recording needs.
Playing a lot of six games a week.
Yeah.
And you want to go out and drink a couple of those nights.
You're out till 4 a.m. What are you going to do when you get to the clubhouse?
Yep.
Take some Greenies. What are you going to do if you take a bunch of acid not knowing if you're going to pitch? Take some Greenies.
Take some Greenies. That's so interesting because I wonder how jacked up he got, because he said he took a bunch of Greenies when he got to we're talking Doc Ellis, when he got to the ballpark, and I bet it just kind of clouded his acid just enough to where he could pitch.
Yeah, I mean, like, as far as acid's concerned, I've never taken, like, an upper. Like, I'll have a couple beers on the way down, just to kind of, like, level off and go to sleep. I cannot imagine that combination.
No, it's so weird.
Having to go out in front of people and throw a baseball accurately.
Yeah.
Oh, but the Greenies, I mean, they worked. That's why they were so effective. And another thing I wanted to bring to this conversation is kind of, you mentioned sweeping it under the rug. What a lot of people don't know is the Baseball Players Union is not only the strongest union in professional sports, they are also one of the strongest unions in this whole damn country.
Yeah.
That's why the contracts are guaranteed. That's why the players are treated so well. I mean,
and that's why the drug testing was so
delayed. Because, and we're going to get into this in a future one, where cocaine was very popular. The players union prevented them from drug testing the players who weren't involved.
Yes.
Because the commissioner at the time, and Bowie Kuhn probably would have been for drug testing for Greenies, getting him out of the game. But when your players union is that strong, they're going to screw you over. I mean, they're going to tell you no, they're going to block you.
Yeah, there's not much Major League Baseball could have done at that point, which is kind of sad because there were so many players that had problems post-career.
Exactly.
There's so many players that had careers cut short. We'll talk about some of those, but the lack of, and this is why I love Doc Ellis, was the lack of rehab for these players. It was almost non-existent, and that was his, like, that's what he wanted to do post-career, was like make sure that these ball players had rehab available for them.
Yeah, and baseball has good pension plans. The union always protects the players, but they never had the foresight to see because you're addicted to drugs is what you are. I mean, for lack of a better phrase, you're addicted to drugs. You're addicted to amphetamines. And they just kind of swept it under the rug and let it go away.
Yeah.
Let it go away.
Which is sad. But it's both parties to blame.
It is. It definitely is. Because, you didn't have a Commissioner Landis say, ban players for gambling. You never had one say, we need to clean this up right now.
Exactly.
And we need to discuss maybe shorter seasons. We need to discuss testing these players. We need to look into what they're doing the second that they're not playing baseball anymore.
Yeah.
We need to do some actual research. But
that didn't come till not even early 2000s. It was like 2008, 9,
the
10.
mid-2000s.
Yeah, that's like when, which is crazy to even say that they had this problem for 50 years, 55 years before they even addressed it.
Exactly, because it was so ingrained in the culture of baseball.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, it's always been a boys' club. It's
yeah.
always been not like a country club mentality, but more of like a frat mentality.
I was thinking more like Vegas, when a bunch of guys go to Vegas,
yeah, that
like
too, yeah.
What happens here stays here. Am I right, guys? And
exactly.
Then
what happens here stays here. Now take these 10 pills and play right field for the next 9 innings for 10 days in a row.
Exactly. It's ridiculous, but that was the state of baseball. And my question is, because this was the golden era of baseball, do you think that hitting suffered and pitching excelled through these drugs, or do you think it kind of equaled out? Does that make sense?
To me, it's the whole steroids thing. If everybody is taking them, nobody really has an advantage.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the guys who are taking it have an advantage over the guys playing clean, obviously.
Yeah, the guy's naked.
Yeah, the guy's playing naked. But yeah, I mean, no, I don't think it suffered. It's just baseball was played then differently as far as strategy than it is today because of analytics, good or bad.
Oh, okay.
So different style. I don't think the play necessarily suffered. I think the players themselves suffered once they had to either kick the habit or they became addicted and while they played, maybe making bad decisions, but I don't necessarily think the quality suffered.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can see the quality of hitting improved in the roid era, but because of Greenies being pretty much used by everybody, it's hard to say that the quality of baseball dropped off or improved at all. That's kind of just what the quality of baseball was at that point.
And I'm sure plenty of guys were taking steroids and Greenies. I mean, when you're at that high level of anything that you do, you're basically wanting to get a competitive edge over everybody. Like I was reading stories about guys in the 1800s taking like sheep and dog testicles because of the testosterone, so it would make them play better. I mean, no matter what angle, there's always something new for guys to like get that little bit of an edge, because to be a professional at something so hard, you always want that competitive edge.
And they're always trying to kind of shoot that angle and get away with it.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing with Greenies, is because there wasn't, unlike other drugs which were vilified, Greenies were encouraged. Like, you know, when you hear about the steroid era, which we'll talk about later, but I just wanted to bring this up because of how pervasive the Greenies and Benzedrine and all that shit was, is guys would do it and you would know the other guys were doing it, but they would be shooting up in the bathroom. They wouldn't be out in the open like a bowl, like take one like of Halloween candy.
Well, we'll get into the roid thing. Why McGuire, I think, got busted was he had it in his locker and a reporter wrote it down.
Well, like, the androstenedione, I mean, that's not necessarily a steroid. It's a testosterone supplement, but that's when this discussion started. Yeah.
And it's one of those things where with roids, even that being out in the open was so not the way that drug was being passed around.
Exactly. Yeah. Greenies were passed around like candy.
Yes.
Like guys were beaning up before game, everything. I mean, like it was like a veteran would see a rookie who had just had his first professional night out on the town and be like, I got some for you, kid.
Yep.
You got to play today.
Here, I got some of this coffee. And they say, and what you said before we recorded, the coffee actually injects the amphetamine into the bloodstream faster. So sometimes they would like drink coffee before the game, and then like sixth inning, they would have a cup. And
lots of players would talk about, you would know the guys who were taking the Greenies because of how much coffee they were drinking.
Yeah.
Like some guys would just have like a cup before a game and play naked. Like just, hey, it's 10:30 in the morning. I need a coffee.
Yeah.
And then you see a guy drinking 6 cups of coffee and you're like, okay, I definitely know what this guy is doing.
Yeah.
So.
And that was the other thing, is they weren't putting like 1 or 2 Greenies into this coffee. They were putting like an entire thing of pills in. You know what I mean? Like 20 to 30 and then letting it roast, you know? Like it's so interesting to see the guys. If you watch baseball from that era, there's guys that are like literally pinning, like tweaking out on the baseball field. And then there's other guys who are so focused. It must do, that's why I was interested to hear what you thought about the quality, because it must do different things to these different ball players.
It does. Like, you know how I'm like a laser focused guy, right?
Yeah.
So this is just a story about taking drugs similar to it. In college, I did grad level history. So I was very prepared, very on the ball. So like maybe a month before we had to do a paper, it was 30 pages plus a 10+ page annotated bibliography. So I'm like a month before, but I'm like, I'm going to get a little bit of it done. You know, I'm going to try and finish the rough draft, probably maybe get halfway through, none of the bibliography. I go back to my apartment. It's like maybe 9 o'clock at night. I was hanging out with my family earlier in the day, and I pop an Adderall. This is the first time I've ever taken Adderall. It dialed my ass in so good, but to like a scary extent. I not only finished a 36-page paper, I did a 15-page annotated bibliography, had no idea I even did it. And then like 3:30 the next day, I woke up and was like, what the fuck just happened? I'm never doing this again.
Yeah, see, that's a little like very similar drugs that I think we'll get into a little bit later. But it's one of those things where I wonder if these guys were like, we played yesterday?
Yeah.
Especially at the rate that they were taking them.
Yeah, because like I took 1 Adderall.
Yeah.
I'm not taking like 10 amphetamines at once. You know what I mean? Like, because that's the thing is like you either do it once, like a Hank Aaron and go, I can't do this. My body rejects this.
Yeah.
Or you end up like Doc Ellis, because after you do one's not going to get you every time. You need two. And then two's not going to get you every time until you're just like M&M'ing them in your mouth.
Yeah, I know. My friend told me to start seizing the day, but then I had to start seizing 2 or 3 days. I was just kidding. That's just a joke.
You just get addicted to Carpe Diem is what happens.
Exactly. I was seizing a month at a time. It just wasn't working. But that's the truth with this drug. Like 1 just wasn't working anymore, and then 5 weren't working anymore. And then with Doc, you hear him throw a bunch of pills on the ground, like 30, and then whichever one stood up straight, he would take. And then if enough weren't standing up straight, he would just grab a handful and take them. Oh, my God. And you'd just be like, God, look, he didn't even know how much he was taking. You know?
Not at all. Because at that point, you're so tweaked out, you don't even care. You're just like, it's baseball day. Okay.
Exactly. It's baseball day, which is wild. But that's just the way it was for Greenies in that throughout the entire pretty much drug era of baseball.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like, because the pressure gets up to you and you're taking a drug, which is such an upper. And then what do you do the 5 months out of the year that you're not playing?
That was something else that I wanted to. Would they literally stop taking Greenies in the off season?
See, I can't imagine that they would, only because it's so addictive.
Yeah.
It's like, maybe you're taking less, but like, man, you just run that marathon. I bet you some guys, though, they probably just crashed and didn't do anything. They were like, oh, thank God it's over.
And I wonder, like, training camps, shit like that, when guys would come back, they would be so off because they've been literally off of Greenies for 4 months.
Well, that's what spring training's for, right?
Exactly. And I wonder if that was like the big thing with spring training, was just like, let's get you back on those Greenies. Let's get you back focused. And it's just like, that was the era. I was actually looking for that, like people talking about off-season use, but they didn't really. It was just all.
And that's kind of the thing, is the era that it was so popular in, because now you have like tell-alls about other drugs and other performance enhancers. Is like, that was during a time where players and sports writers kept everything in-house. Yeah, everything hidden, because sports writers at that time weren't journalists. They were just friends of the players writing puff pieces.
Yeah, which I think is kind of interesting to keep it in that boys club. Was literally, if a story would show a ball club in a poor light, the writers wouldn't want that to get out, because they love that ball club.
And they love that ball club, and the ball club's going to turn against him and then just hire another lackey for themselves, you know.
So I wonder all the stories that happened, especially 50s through the 80s, about just crazy shit with Greenies, because I mean, they're amphetamines, you know?
They are, and guys wouldn't even take them in pill form. It's been alleged Willie Mays, at the end of his career when he was with the Mets in the early to mid-'70s, he had a little tonic called Red Juice that was apparently loaded with that stuff.
Yeah.
So Pete Rose would talk about Greenies. He's admitted he took them.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't have any shame. He just said, well, they're not like steroids. They only really keep you alert and stuff. And it's like, well, motherfucker, that's still a performance enhancer.
Yeah, it was interesting because he came out talking a lot of shit on the guys trying to get into the Hall of Fame for using roids, and how like it was so against the game. But then literally in the next sentence, he was like, oh yeah, I was using Greenies like all the time.
Well,
it's like, just like, okay.
It's like my drugs and baseball bit, how you have to have throwback night.
Yes.
Where you do the different drugs of the era. And at least in my opinion, if you're going to crap on guys like Clemens and Bonds, who had Hall of Fame careers while playing clean before even turning into mutants that made them dominant into their late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah.
Why don't you take a look in the mirror, baseball sports writers, at all of the players who took Greenies from this era?
Well, let's bring up an old podcast that we did on Boggs, because Boggs is notoriously a big Greenie guy, and that's why he could drink 60 beers.
Well, because he's a big Greenie guy, it makes so much sense that he drank that much.
Yes.
To level himself out, because you got the downers and the uppers. You're basically creating a trailer park fucking leveling off system.
Oh, I like
what he was
that.
doing.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
a trailer park equilibrium is what he was trying to go for.
Yeah, exactly. Boggs is from Florida. It makes so much goddamn sense. All right, I'm going to look more into this after this episode now that I'm like registering it in my brain.
This is where we start getting the conspiracy going. Boggs and the Greenies.
Boggs and the Greenies are turning the frogs gay.
But it's just one of those things where I wonder if the guys from the late 90s, 2000s look at roids like not a big deal. Do you know what I mean? Where the guys from earlier look at Greenies like not a big deal.
I bet you they do, and I say this for one reason. Until the Mitchell report came out and MLB did something about steroids, they weren't illegal.
No.
They were frowned upon. If you didn't want to do them, you didn't do them.
Yeah.
But guys that wanted to do them, they did them. Obviously, they hit it more than the Greenies, but they probably look at it. I'll get to it in the steroids episode.
Yeah, we'll get it.
But basically, to sum that part up, they probably looked at it as the exact same thing. I mean, if there's no rule against it, like,
why wouldn't they?
I'm going to do it. And there's an economic aspect, which is longer, which I'll discuss later. But why wouldn't you do it if it's not illegal?
Yeah, why wouldn't you shoot that corner and try and make yourself just that much better?
Yeah. Like I said, it's the competitive edge that these psychopaths, professional athletes want. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So that's going to be our part 1 of drugs in baseball with Greenies. Join us for our part 2, cocaine. That's going to be up next. So thank you all. Yeah, we're going to get into it. Trust us.
All right.
Thank you.
Take it easy.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to that podcast. This is just a stock message at the end of all of our podcasts, so we hope you enjoy. You listen to whatever athlete that was. Give us a follow at the Sports Experience Podcast on Instagram. Also, myself at Quinn Comedy on Instagram. Also, DiTolla Dominic on Instagram. Just follow us all around. If you have any suggestions for any athletes you want us to do, shoot us an email at the Sports Experience Podcast at gmail.com. And we always are recording right here at Engle Studio. Thank you all very much.